Well, good morning and welcome to Sunday School and the first session of our summer series, Pathways of Discipleship. Whether you're a visitor or member or just catching a class via this recording, we're glad to have you with us. Over the coming weeks, we'll be exploring various pathways of discipleship as we remember the faithful living takes different shapes and leads us down different paths. We will turn first towards the lives and legacies of individuals represented in our newest stained glass windows, the Reverend Dr. Daniel Jackson Sanders, the Reverend Dr. Rachel Henderlight, the Reverend Dr. Elo Henderson, and the Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, along with the Stapleton Davidson internship. Dr. Willie Griffin is here this morning to help us in this understanding of the lives of these individuals. So let's open with prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day and for the opportunity to gather together. We give you thanks for curious minds, for the desire within all of those gathered here to learn more about the shape of discipleship. In our listening and in our learning, may we grow in our own discipleship, understanding more and more how it is that you call us to walk humbly with you. Through Christ we pray. Amen. I think I know most everybody here. I'm John Baxter. I had the unique privilege of chairing the task force that settled on the windows, and happy to get this kicked off and have shared the greater story of the people behind those we chose. And starting with Daniel Jackson. Basically, we were looking for a 19th century individual to replace Palmer because that's where it was located in the windows. If you remember, it's sort of in the middle on the left side. So that's where we arrived at and also honoring Johnson C. Smith, which has been part of our community, as you all well know. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Willie Griffin, who teaches in several areas at UNC Charlotte, was previously on the faculty at the Citadel, and was also a staff historian for the Levine Museum of the New South. He is currently completing his first book, a biography that aims to contribute to a deeper understanding of the civil rights movement. The book, entitled Come Out Fighting, Tarzan W. Anderson, The Black Press, and Black Freedom Struggles, and is scheduled to be published next year in 26. Dr. Griffin received his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill and is a proud graduate of Morehouse College. We're grateful to have him here with us this morning, and he will spend the most part of this hour talking about Dr. Sanders. And without further ado, Willie, welcome.
Thank you, John, for that introduction, and welcome. Good morning to everyone. I'm so happy and excited to be a part of this journey. When I was asked about 2 years ago now, it's been close to 2 years, I was delighted that Covenant, such a prominent church, is taking the lead to, make history in the city. And so I've been interested in the life of Daniel Jackson Sanders for some time now. I've just finished writing a chapter of my first book, which explores Sanders' impact, not only on the growth and development of Biddle University and the surrounding Biddleville community, but also the lives of the mother and grandparents of Trezvant Anderson, who I'm writing a biography about. And I'll perhaps talk a bit more about that influence a little later. But I found a few quotes from Sanders that I wanted to begin with to set the stage today's talk that I think encapsulates his faith. He once wrote that, quote, God does not blunder or make mistakes. And he went on to say that, quote, the divine being has uniformly and continuously overruled all events for the better, end quote. And so these quotes appeared in 1899, the 70th anniversary edition of The Evangelist, which was the national mouthpiece of the Presbyterian Church. It was an article entitled Lifting Up the Negro, The Evangelist, in December of 1899. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other quote that I pulled that I think really sets the tone. 2 years prior to writing in his newspaper, the Africo-American Presbyterian, he wrote, quote, "The gospel with its saving power should be brought to bear upon the people with renewed energy and power. The light of its truth will drive out the darkness," end quote. So in many ways, I hope that the light that shines on Covenant Stain's glass window will help begin to bring Sanders' life out of the darkness, and so that more people can learn about his journey and the significance in not only African American history, but in Presbyterian history and larger American history. It is a story that deserves to be widely disseminated. Again, I commend you all for making that decision to have Dr. Sanders there. So some of the sources that I consulted to really begin to uncover his life's work and his journey, the trails, included Workers' Progress Administration papers from the New Deal. There were census records, of course, wills of the slave owners, newspaper databases, and a few secondary sources, and that included some theological works, some really important theological works that influenced Daniel Sanders right after slavery. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. There was also a really interesting, he apparently wrote an autobiography of himself. As many enslaved people who rise to such prominent positions do. But unfortunately, it has gone missing. This is something that, as I said, he is someone who is definitely, I've considered writing a biography about, and I may continue searching for that autobiography. And we can perhaps talk about that at the end. Okay, there we go. Okay. So I want to talk about the keys points to understanding are really, I'm trying to want to show the deep roots of the Presbyterian Church for Dr. Sanders, how it influenced Christian theology and practice in his life, and really portray him as an important 20th century Presbyterian leader, someone who has not at least been given a lot of credit. Okay, I turned it on. I turned it off and back on. Let's see. Okay. Okay. No worries, no worries. I got you. Okay. So his story obviously begins in slavery. The entrenchment, the adoption and entrenchment of slavery in the state of South Carolina should be well known by those who understand the institution's history in this country. Shortly after Charleston's founding in 1670, the settlement became a major port for the transatlantic slave trade. From its beginning, South Carolina's economy was built on slave labor. By 1708, enslaved African Americans outnumbered white settlers in the colony, a trend that will continue for generations. And so the map that you're looking at portrays, you probably can't see it from this way, the numbers are really small, but it portrays the percentages of the entire population that slaves accounted for. And so rice plantations in the low country became some of the most profitable agricultural enterprises in North America, largely due to enslaved Africans' knowledge of rice cultivation, indigo, and later cotton, which also fueled the economy, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. And so this system created an elite planter class and made South Carolina one of the wealthiest per capita of the original 13 colonies. And this was wealth that was directly built on slavery. And so what a lot of people who understand South Carolina's history may not know about that history is that many of the plantation owners had to be plantation owner in absentee because they could not, the weather was unfitting for their health. And so many of them who wanted to remain in South Carolina made their way up to the upstate of South Carolina, which is Fairfield. You can't, the larger, the darker counties have the larger populations, and the darkest county, which is the furthest up north towards the North Carolina border, is Fairfield County, and it had one of the larger percentages of African Americans. I believe that 78.6% of the population was African Americans, and so this is where Daniel Sanders was born in 1847. Slide. So Fairfield County's economy was heavily reliant on slave labor, particularly for the cultivation of short staple cotton, which became the dominant cash crop in the early 19th century following the invention of the cotton gin. By 1850, enslaved individuals comprised approximately 2/3 of the county's population, underscoring the central role in the region's agricultural outposts. Notable plantations such as Hog Fork and Melrose exemplify this reliance. Melrose Plantation was managed by Nicholas Addison P. Was one of the largest in the upstate. The P family owned 19 plantations, approximately 1,000 enslaved people. And Hog Fork, on the other hand, was owned by Daniel Hall Sr. His plantations spanned 6,000 acres and employed up to 400 enslaved individuals in 1850. Hall was perhaps the wealthiest member of the elite Hall family, which included Thomas Hall, who, according to WPA records, owned the mother of Sanders, Laura Witzel Sanders, pictured here in an undated photo with Daniel Jackson Sanders. And so the Hall family, I put these images up here. I could not find any images of Thomas Hall himself, but I found his headstone. It says he was born. Died in 1847, born shortly before the turn of the 18th century, and he was a Methodist minister. He comes from, again, a very large family, mostly of doctors. There's at least 5 doctors in his family. One of them, Dr. William Hall, I only have a picture of his house. And he is important because he is the person who managed Thomas's Hall will after he died. And so I was able to examine Thomas Hall's will to try to see if there was any mention of Laura Sanders, but there wasn't any mention of Laura Sanders. But he did indicate that upon his death that he would leave a certain amount of enslaved people to his wife, and the rest, if there were, would be dispersed to his children, and the others would be sold. And so it's apparent from the little bit of autobiographical information that I have from Daniel Sanders is that his mother was one of those enslaved people who was sold to another master, and so we don't know who that master was. But Thomas Hall, as I indicated, it was a Methodist minister, and Sanders does not indicate whether or not Hall was a harsh slave owner, and he would not have known from personal experience because Hall died less than a month after he was born. And it was not uncommon for Southern Methodist ministers who came from wealthy families to own plantations and utilize enslaved labor. Hall likely introduced ideas of theology to his enslaved, as Southern Methodists often promoted the idea of Christian slavery, believing that it was scripturally justifiable institution, claiming that it was a benevolent institution under proper guidance. So therefore, it is safe to assume that Sanders' mother likely introduced him to theological ideas, as Thomas Hall would have heavily influenced her before his death. Slide. And so in 1856, at the age of 9-year-old, Sanders was forced to learn the trade of a shoemaker. I imagine that he was perhaps sold to one of the plantations that had a very large enslaved population. And so those people who were enslaved often not only harvested crops, they also tried to find many other ways that they could earn money off of their enslaved. And Sanders, being such a young boy at the time, he perhaps thought that it was fitting that he learned how to make shoes. And so As the war clouds gathered from regional tension over the spread of slavery, Sanders recalled, quote, a perceptible change took place in the treatment of slaves. Men who had been humane and indulgent became exacting, and some of them cruel, end quote. During those years, he was forced to serve every waking hour making shoes. He asserted, I became determined to gain more education from books. By the war's end, he was not only a master shoe craftsman, but had taught himself to spell and read from a mutilated copy of a blue-black speller and a little book called Crown of Thorns that I'll talk a little bit about. And so this image comes from, actually does not come from South Carolina. This image comes from Brazil, slavery in Brazil. So this was not just relegated to North America. These were trades that were taught wherever the institution of slavery existed. Slide. So the blue-black speller at the time in the 1850s was perhaps the most popular book in America. It was how Americans learned how to read. They learned through phonics, and I have images here, too small to see. But the Crown of Thorns is the most important book to young Sanders' life. The Crown of Thorns, A Token for Sorrowing, was written by Edwin Chapin. It's a collection of religious discussions written in the mid-19th century, offering profound reflections on suffering, hope, and Christian perspective on sorrow. Chapin's work aimed to provide consolation to those in distress, drawing from his personal experiences, particularly the then recent loss of his own child. The book comprises of 10 chapters, each exploring distinct aspects of grief and spiritual resilience. For instance, The Mission of Little Children was written shortly after Chapin's son's death, and it reflected on the purpose and impact of children in one's life and the solace found in their memory. Chapin emphasizes that life's challenges and sorrows are integral to spiritual growth. He suggests that suffering can lead to deeper understanding of faith and a closer relationship with God. The title metaphor, Crown of Thorns, symbolizes the idea that through enduring hardship, one can attain spiritual triumph and inner peace. Other prominent themes included suffering as a path of spiritual growth. He suggests that life trials are opportunities for personal and spiritual development. Resilience and hope. The discussions encourage readers to find strength and hope amidst adversity. So Christian perspective on grief. And so these works provided insight into viewing sorrow through a Christian lens and discovering meaning and comfort in faith. And so if this is something that Daniel Sanders spent quite a bit of time with on learning to read. He actually said that he sewed these books into a secret pocket into his coat pocket. Whenever he had time, he would steal away when he could from making shoes. That he would go and learn how to read through the blue-black speller and just pour through memorizing lines from the Crown of Thorns. And so I believe that this book is what profoundly transformed his belief in the condition of slavery and the belief that God did not make blunders. It was preparing him for the future. This became something that he memorized passage after passage for years, for the last at least 9 years of his life under slavery. Slide. So after the Civil War, Sanders set forth to seek his fortune, but was first determined to obtain a good education. He benefited from the belief system of the founders of the American Presbyterianism, which held that learning was essential to spiritual growth and piety. As Northern Presbyterian missionaries fanned out across the South to establish elite parochial schools like Brainerd Institute in nearby Chester, South Carolina, Sanders seized the opportunity to be among the school's first students in 1866. He recalled walking barefooted, I think 100, not barefooted, but he walked over 30-something odd miles to get to Chester in one day. And he said he made it just to the edge of town the night before and found a place to sleep in a mill before the next day he made his way to the log cabin where Brainerd began. And so while there, he studied arithmetic, geography, grammar, history, Greek, Latin, and religion under Dr. S. Loomis. And he could finally pocket the money from making shoes he earned by crafting for those residents of Charleston. And so Loomis became a really important mentor in Sanders' life, introducing him to Presbyterian missionary spirit that as he worked to establish churches throughout the region. Strangely enough, I could not find a lot of information about Loomis. I don't think that he was a very popular person in South Carolina for trying to provide educational opportunities for African Americans, and many of the newspapers just totally ignored him. I couldn't even find a date of his death. He's definitely someone who probably needs to be uplifted in that region. But these images here, this is an image of Brainerd Institute. The top image is from 1910. The image on the bottom right is an image of a school teacher because the Brainerd Institute was founded by two women who came from New York and New Jersey, Miss E.E. Richmond and Miss Caroline Kent from New Jersey. And it was a year later that Loomis joined them after they got started. And so the image is a popular image in history books that document the role that women played as missionaries coming into the South and educating newly and freed African Americans in these makeshift log cabins and so the other image, I think today Brainerd Institute has become a cultural museum institution in local Chester. The work of Felicia Rashad and others who at Howard who had relatives graduate, they worked to raise money to restore it. And so it is a museum and a cultural institute today. After the Civil War, let me see, where am I? Okay, no. Slide. Okay, so with the help of Loomis, Sanders decided to enter Western Theological Seminary in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, and this was in 1871. Initially chartered in 1844 on the banks of the Allegheny River in Allegheny City, which is now a part of Pittsburgh. The school was created to provide alternative access to Presbyterian theological training west of the Allegheny Mountains, because there had been many Presbyterians who had begun to migrate to that region. And in Pennsylvania, the only options for theological training would have been to go to Princeton University, and crossing the Allegheny Mountain had become such a chore, so the Presbyterian Church decided to set up Western Theological. Theological students at Western were required to be well versed in the original languages of the Holy Scripture, knowledgeable about both Jewish and Christian antiquities, and among other things, well acquainted with ancient geography. After 3 years, Sanders graduated with honors and received top commendations for excelling in both Hebrew and Sanskrit, meaning that he graduated at the top of his class for being able to speak both of those better than any of the other students. Upon graduation, he briefly returned to Chester, South Carolina in 1874 to assume the principalship of the town's public school for black children, but he only remained there for a year. Slide. And so this is an image of Chestnut Presbyterian Church, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But he made his way after leaving Chester to the port city of Wilmington. And Wilmington, as you know, you may or may not know, was the largest city in North Carolina, perhaps the most important city in North Carolina, long before Charlotte rose to challenge that, the size and important in terms of economy. By 1910, I believe, is when Charlotte overtook the importance of Wilmington. But Wilmington was the home of one of the largest, perhaps most prominent and progressive black communities in the South before the turn of the 20th century. And the reason for this is that because during the Civil War, many enslaved Africans who began to escape from plantations, they made their way up the coastal states of North and South Carolina and ended up staying around Wilmington. And it was there that many of the Union forces, African American troops, were recruited from Wilmington, and many of them remained in Wilmington after the Civil War. And so again, the city became a really a haven for the progressive black community. And by the turn of the 20th century, they had a larger population than their white counterparts. Sanders immediately became a central leader in the city's black community. Shortly after arriving, he was elected to serve as the principal of the Wilmington Educational Institute. The school, according to local history, was one of the most influential institutions in the black community. It was a place where talented educators could provide an atmosphere for learning and promote neighborhood pride, which is something he took with him when he came to Charlotte to try to build Biddleville into this really prized neighborhood. Sanders only led the school briefly as he began to take a greater role in regional Presbyterian leadership and international missionary work. And so it was at this time when he entered Wilmington, as I've talked a little bit about how important Wilmington is, he began to take on important leadership roles within the Atlantic Synod. It was founded in 1869 to begin to spread Presbyterian churches all throughout this region. And in 1875, when he came to Wilmington, Sanders was initially appointed temporary clerk. The Synod at that time consisted of 6 presbyteries, 44 ministers, and 99 churches. In 1876, the same year that he was selected to lead Chestnut Street Presbyterian Church, and Chestnut Street is the most significant black church in the state of North Carolina. It was the oldest congregation in Wilmington, but also the oldest black church in the state. And it was founded as a mission church, I believe, in 1858. Because again, the coming of the Civil War, it was already understood that slavery was coming to an end. And so the Presbyterian Church began to try to establish missions for African Americans. And so Northern Presbyterians in 1876 also called upon him to lead a mission through Europe to raise money to promote education and Presbyterianism among blacks in the American South and Africa as well. He spent almost a year abroad visiting Edinburgh, Glasgow, Paris, London, and several other populous cities. He returned to Wilmington later that year in 1876, and he had raised over $6,000, which was a substantial amount of money for that time, which he used as an endowment for an African scholarship to fund and prepare Biddle University graduates to do mission work in Africa on behalf of the Presbyterian Church. Because of Sanders' successful money-raising efforts, he was asked to serve on Biddle's Board of Trustees upon his return. And so you begin to see this setting up in his close relationship with Biddle. In addition to resuming his pastorate duties at Chestnut Street Presbyterian, he became assistant editor of the non-secular Charlotte-based newspaper called the Southern Evangelist. And so the Southern Evangelist was the southern wing of the Presbyterian Church's newspaper Evangelist, which primarily, the Southern Evangelist at that time featured the writings of white Presbyterian professors from Biddle Institute. And he continued to serve in leadership roles within the Atlantic Synod. In 1877, he was appointed moderator. In 1878, he again held the position as temporary clerk. But most importantly, his most important achievement at this time, I think, is when he started his own religious newspaper in 1880, the Afro-American Presbyterian, which eventually absorbed the Southern Evangelist and operated out of Wilmington. He used the newspaper to highlight religious activities and instruction, and help meet the educational, material, moral, and religious interest of black people living in Wilmington and throughout its wider distribution across the country. The black newspaper became a powerful information center to further emancipate and educate freedmen in the region that had become more volatile and hostile about their advancement since the collapse of the federally supported or sponsored Reconstruction efforts. While the editorial policies of the Afro-American Presbyterian focused more on moral upliftment through the religious-based news, from time to time, Sanders would find ways to use the pages of the Africo to speak directly out against racism facing African Americans in the South, which was a fairly courageous thing to do at the time, because not a lot of people know that the Africo it holds the distinction of being one of the oldest and continuously operated black newspapers in the South, and lasted until the 1930s. There had been many attempts to establish African American newspapers in the South right after the Civil War, but most of them collapsed after a period of 2 to 3 years. So to establish a newspaper in 1880 and have it to run for the duration that it did was a really incredible feat, especially considering the fact that he spoke out against racism whenever he could. As early as 1886, Sanders began discussing moving his newspaper to Biddle's campus because Charlotte was becoming a newspaper center. It was the place where I think the Southern newspaper printing industry, which printed newspapers for various enterprises all across the South. They had them printed and shipped them out. And so, but you also had the Star of Zion, which is another African American religious newspaper, and the Charlotte Messenger. So it really was becoming a newspaper center. And so, again, by 1886, he was beginning to discuss moving the newspaper to Biddle because of this. And it sort of foreshadows his move to Biddle. Slide. So when Sanders finally came to Charlotte in 1891, he brought his evolving philosophical ideas about what he called the new Negro. And this is the first time that in all my studies, that I see the new Negro used this early on in American history. Most often when we think about the new Negro, we think about the Harlem Renaissance and we think about artists. But Sanders is using the term in relation to the New South, this idea of the New South being forward-thinking and enterprising. And in articles that he talks about the new Negro, he talks about African Americans moving forward away from the rural countryside and farms and looking to become more enterprising and educated. And more importantly, in addition to this philosophical ideas, he brought the role of religion and education in uplifting black communities. He thought that these were the two most important things to help lift African American communities, along with the newspaper, to Biddle University. Sanders becomes the first African American to lead a 4-year institution of learning, higher learning in the South. And so when I first heard this, I was blown away, because how is it that we know nothing about this person? You know, this was an amazing feat, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But his election, however, was not universally celebrated, and it contributed to the already growing unrest in Charlotte's race relations. A few weeks before Sanders was installed at Biddle University's president, a black man was arrested on accusations of killing an Italian store owner. A white lynch mob formed to seize the man to mete out extra-legal justice, but black ministers organized local African Americans to intervene. As an act of retaliation for the minister's audacity to organize, the city's oldest black church, which was then only known as Zion AMEZ, it's now Clinton AME Zion, which is not far, just a few hundred yards from Biddle University. It was riddled with bullets by a local white militia. Regional and national newspaper headlines suggested that a race war and race troubles were imminent, and there was a growing need to address resurfacing rumors that African Americans were seeking quote-unquote Negro rule. This politically charged atmosphere made Sanders' ascendancy even more concerning to some local whites. There was deep-seated ideas about racial inferiority, and led to all but one Biddle University's white faculty members and some of the board members to resign when he was appointed. Sanders worked tirelessly to quell the uncertainty about his ability to lead Biddle University and ease the angst that he nor other local African Americans were focused on ruling over their white counterparts, politically or economically. He wrote editorials in the Charlotte Observer, asserted that Biddle students would be more profitably engaged in activities that improved the morale of the community, and were less engaged in organizing festivities of leisure. When the Observer carelessly connected blacks arrested for petty crimes with Biddle students, he and black faculty quickly refuted the claims by sending letters to the newspaper. Sanders traveled all throughout the Northeast and as far as Canada to provide what he described as entertaining accounts of how the university was conducted. He made it clear that he intended to mold the university and the surrounding village into an economically self-sufficient and independent community, one that African Americans and white city leaders alike could be proud of. Here, again, it is important to note that Daniel Jackson Sanders should be remembered popularly as Booker T. Washington, or even Frederick Douglass. As these two characters or figures we most often remember for being enslaved and rising to great heights. They often found a way to teach themselves how to read. And again, so this is why I think that Daniel Jackson Sanders deserves to be among these important figures. But Southern white leadership largely supported Booker T. Washington because he publicly advocated only for vocational training for African Americans. It is for this reason that throughout the South and the larger country, he was considered one of the safest people to teach about in schools because he was non-threatening. And I don't know about you, but I often remember being taught about Booker T. Washington through this sort of dichotomy between he and W.B. Du Bois. Is it Booker T or W.E.B., right? And Sanders often was found, if you read newspapers, he was often found in the same circles, in the same gatherings as these people. But again, he has not been given that same kind of attention. And so this article that you see on the side, which is perhaps Sanders' most important, was his response to Washington and the increasing racial violence that followed his famous Atlanta Compromise speech of 1865. In this two-part article, Sanders argued that African Americans needed a more holistic education and that ultimately prepared them for leadership positions within the community. He often talked about the importance of not only having vocational education, which Johnson C. Smith had, or Biddle had before it became Johnson C. Smith, but he also talked about the importance of theological education because it prepared African Americans for leadership opportunities in their community. But also, many of the very first graduates of Biddle went on to become medical doctors and so forth. So he just felt like, the holistic education is what best prepared African Americans to become responsible citizens in the larger country. He asserted that, quote, a people who en masse find and proceed along the line of the least possible resistance will get cornered sooner or later. Slide. And so this last slide, I'll just talk about the last 7 years of his life. Sanders was a respected leader in the National Presbyterian Church. Searching for his footprints in newspaper databases, I came across article after article that placed him in prominent circles of the National Presbyterian leadership. He was often invited and asked to speak at national conventions and weighed in on important issues that the church was grappling with, such as the ongoing missionary work that was needed in the South, needed in Africa, approving more funding for Biddle University, how to make Sundays a more respected day among the masses, and how to handle divisions of the National Presbyterian bodies that mostly revolved around race. And so, again, I can't tell you how many articles I found in trying to find the ones that were best to include in the slide. It's just it was a hard decision to make. But so I guess I want to open it up for Q&A right now. But it was a fascinating. I guess I should. Before I begin, I should talk a little bit about how I am writing and treating Sanders in my own work. And it relates back to his reading, I think, and what I argue in my chapter, his reading of The Crown of Thorns. Trezvant Anderson was born in 1906, just a year before Sanders died. And Sanders was a huge believer in the importance of marriage in the black community and to keeping marriages together. Now, oftentimes, mainstream newspapers were a little skeptical skeptical of black marriage. They often tried to raise the alarm of the amount of African Americans getting married at the time, and they encouraged more whites to get married so that African Americans would not produce more than they would. And it was very interesting. And so the portrayal that newspapers tried to show that African Americans were unfit fathers. It just so happened that when Anderson's mother met his father on the campus of Biddle University, his father was a night watchman on campus. And he attempted to abandon Amanda Tresvant Anderson's mother when he found out that she was pregnant. And and at that time, there were these laws called seduction laws that had to be obeyed. And these laws were primarily meant to protect the sanctity of white women. If a man had gotten a white woman pregnant and then tried to abandon her, these laws could be enacted to force the man to take care of his responsibilities. And very rarely would these laws be deployed to protect black women. But because Sanders got involved in this case, because his mother and grandmother and great-grandmother had all been domestics on the campus of Biddle, he went to the sheriff's office to demand that Tresvant Anderson's father be brought back from, I believe, Chester, South Carolina, as a matter of fact, brought back from Chester, South Carolina, and made to take care of his responsibilities. And so this was really interesting, an interesting account to me, that to tie Anderson to Sanders, and it really made his life that much more interesting to me, because he always talked about, one of the lines in Crown of Thorns is that every child needs to be able to witness the smiling face of their mother, but also the protection of their father. And so he was very adamant about that. And so I'll end right there. I'm not sure what time it is, but I don't want to ramble on. Good. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Okay. Yes, I said, you asked, was his enslaver a Methodist minister?
But it sounds like that's no connection between, and was that a Fairfield church? I know Fairfield County. I'm trying to picture. Is that a Methodist
Yeah, so
church?
I did some research trying to find out which Methodist church it might have been. I looked at the oldest Methodist church, and I can't recall the name of it at this time, but it was not Thomas Hall. And so from what I've been able to gather is that maybe Thomas Hall was a minister who traveled from local Methodist church to churches. He was on the circuit. And so I believe it was in 1844. The Methodist church, very much like the Presbyterian church, split, they had controversy around this idea of ministers owning slaves. And so it was in 1844, just, I believe, 3 years before Thomas Hall passed away, that a bishop of the Methodist Church in the South, was left slaves in a will by a relative. And it was then that the Methodist Church began to break away from the Northern Methodists. And so from everything that I've read about the Methodist denomination in the South, very much like other denominations, they began to realize or look at slavery as an economic sort of reality that they had to pay attention to, because many of their members were slave owners.
And it sounds like there's no, his coming to Presbyterianism isn't really connected. The Methodism is just kind of a fact of history, right, of his enslaver. Presbyterianism is another journey at another time.
It's another journey, but interestingly enough, and I didn't talk about it here, but when the Presbyterians, I mentioned Reverend Loomis, who came down from the north for the Presbyterian missionary work. It seemed that Fairfield had its own synod, and that there was a huge Presbyterian presence after emancipation. And so I'm not sure, I didn't sort of dig into that history, but yes, there's a huge Presbyterian, the Presbyterians did, the work that they did after emancipation, they by and far did way more than any other denomination in the South. and South Carolina being the state that it was, it would make sense that South Carolina would have been, a haven for Presbyterian churches.
Any other questions? Sure.
I realize that history doesn't end. That Eleanor Roosevelt was a Hall descendant, and
Was she?
and
Wow.
she was torn by that, being talked to her Southern relatives as well as Roosevelt's.
Okay. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I think that at least from what I've been able to gather from the few writings that we have from Sanders, it seems like that his mistreatment may have come after he left Thomas Hall's plantation. And so even within that family that was very large, I imagine there were a lot of different ideologies about how to move forward, how to treat the enslaved, and how just to carry themselves as citizens. I think I mentioned quite a few were doctors. Thomas Hall seemed to be the only minister that was a politician who became very prominent in Fairfield after that. So I did not know that. That's fascinating information.
Thanks very much for your work and all that hard research you're doing, and good luck on finding those primary documents.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's always a struggle. I'm interested in Reconstruction, and this gentleman apparently lived in the thick of that.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about that, and how it may have been described, or what happened on the street, so to speak, during Reconstruction and its collapse?
Yeah.
With when Grant becomes president, he can't handle the pressure, and so things go south, literally.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. I have Sanders does not begin writing really until the late 70s. Reconstruction, as you know, collapsed in 77. I do know that he spent maybe a few months when he left Chester. He spent maybe a few months in Washington, D.C. There was a pretty important stronghold of Presbyterian churches in Northern Virginia. I forget which city. It's a very prominent city today. But that's all I know about his sort of how he would have come into contact with the politics of Reconstruction, because during most of that time he goes to Pennsylvania, Allegheny, which was pretty much a pocket. He was in a bubble, so to speak, while he was in theology school for some of the most important years of Reconstruction. The early years, he would have been in Chester, but again, he would have been trying to keep his head down, continuing to try to learn as much as he can, continuing to read The Crown of Thorns and the new works that he was being introduced by Reverend Loomis. So,
I thought too that it seemed to me, I'm just imagining this among the black community after the Civil War, there may have been a sense of great hope. Blacks were elected to public office in great numbers, state legislatures and even the federal government. And then that all goes away with Jim Crow. So this disparity of public sentiment is...
and that's interesting. I mean,
see if he doesn't provide an insight to that.
Yeah, I think that, now there may be something there because North Carolina is very different than South Carolina. They have a very different history. As we know, South Carolina is a state that elected more black officials during Reconstruction, and immediately at the collapse of Reconstruction, most of those African Americans were removed from office. And that wasn't quite the case in North Carolina. The last person to serve in office in North Carolina was George White. And he doesn't come out of office until, I believe, 1890, late 1890s, I believe. But the area of Wilmington, has been referred to as historians as the Black Tenth, that region, because in most counties, African Americans were the predominant portions of the populations in those counties, and they remained. They had some political power. Is what I'm trying to say. And so this is what actually led while, popularly we think about Reconstruction ending in 1877, some historians argue that we should think about Reconstruction ending with Plessy versus Ferguson and the Wilmington race riots of 1898, because this is the last time that you see African Americans enjoying any kind of political power in North Carolina. And so definitely Sanders would have been an observer to all of that, although he tried to keep his sort of vision focused on morals and religion and through the paper. I'm sure he came into contact with a lot of these black politicians who were in power in Wilmington. But that's definitely something a great.
His reaction to that, or what he said about it, or
yeah. Now,
uncovered that yet.
so you asked me what records would be most, helpful in trying to find out. Now, again, if you take some time to read in the Afro-American Presbyterian newspaper, as I said at the outstart, he did take time to talk about some of the politics. Here it's spread throughout. And so if you have the patience and you're doing the writing, and most of us who do this kind of work do have patience, you have to have patience. It would be very helpful if you took some time and got on. I would recommend North Carolina newspaper, ncnewspaper.com, North Carolina, and they have a databases of. It's an archive database of newspapers all across the state, and the Afro-American Presbyterian has not exactly a full run, but there are enough newspapers that you may be able to glean something about Reconstruction and the writing. And there's also, I think, the Presbyterian website, the Pearl. I can't remember I think it's just the pearl.com, but it's a part of the larger Presbyterian website. Yes, they have some of these Afro-American Presbyterian newspapers, although it's easier to search on ncnewspaper.com. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
What next?
What next for me is finishing this book. It is something, the book that I'm writing about Trezvon Anderson, you cannot begin to imagine how much of an important figure he is, a lot like Sanders. I think Charlotte is a gold mine of history. And I say that. We often, UNC Charlotte gold miners, but it is literally a gold mine for history. It is a microcosm of the United States. A lot of the major themes that run nationally, you see them here in Charlotte. And so Trezvon Anderson has been a labor of love for me. It's been a struggle to track down all of his writings. He becomes a newspaper journalist in 1929 and begins to open up the South for black newspapers all across the South, because black newspapers aren't welcomed unless you are a religious newspaper like the Afro-American or the Star of Zion. And so larger newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, Afro-American, Chicago Defender don't have access to news, what's happening. And Trezvon Anderson uses the railroad as a railway mail clerk to travel in and out of the South with a cloak almost to cover what he's actually doing. He's gathering news, and I argue that this is the beginning of the civil rights movement. John and I were having a conversation about popular knowledge of the civil rights movement has mostly been sort of curated through television. In 1950, only 6% of American homes had televisions. But by 1955, the year after Brown and the year of the Montgomery bus boycott, that number jumped to 68%. And so this is why Americans follow that timeline, 65 or 55, 54 to 68, and it follows King. But black newspapers had been reporting on the development of African Americans organizing all across the South. And Trezvon Anderson is the most important journalist who is doing that. And I've been able to, chase that story down and document it. And so, yeah, next year.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Next week, he'll introduce us and go into greater depth about somebody who grew up in Gastonia, and that's Dr. Rachel Hinderlight, and give us her story. and we look forward to having you here next week. Thank you.
Thank you.